Tonight on Mob Talk, a government witness who buried the John Stanfa mob faction in the mid-90s. Dave Stratweiser and the Inquirer's George Anastasia have more on mob captain John Veasey, the mobster turned informant who captivated the courtroom and delivered big-time results for the feds.
Welcome to this week's edition of Mob Talk. I'm Dave Stratweiser.
And I'm George Anastasia with the Philadelphia Inquirer.
George, this week we're going to talk about John Veasey from the Stanfa era, absolutely buried the Stanfa mob. One
of the most effective witnesses I've ever seen in court. And the interesting thing was he testified a week after his brother was killed right here in an attempt to silence him. And it didn't stop him at all.
So George, John Veasey, about to get on the witness stand, a mob captain going to testify against John Stanfa and all his minions there in court. And the day he's ready to get up and testify, his brother Billy gets killed leaving to go to work.
Ambushed right here as he's pulling out. This is in the middle of the Stanfa trial, and Veasey was a highly important witness, and the trial was delayed 2 or 3 days because of this. And while some would say, you know, how did John go on after they did it to his brother, I think in fact it made him more determined to go forward, to do what he wanted to do, and to make a point that he wanted to make, which is this is over. This kind of stuff has got to stop, you know, and I'm not going to be a part of it anymore. And I think that's what came across when he was on the witness stand.
Okay, and I mean, if you thought that, if the mob guys thought that that was going to shut him up, it obviously didn't work.
Obviously it didn't, and the irony, bottom line, I mean, we come to find out, at the time it happens, everybody assumes it's coming from the Stanfa faction of the mob. In fact, testimony and informants later detail that it in fact came from the Ralph, Natalie, Joey, Merlino faction of the mob. And what it was not so much an attempt to silence John, but to send a message out here in South Philly that if you decide you're going to testify against somebody, you are in jeopardy and your entire family's in jeopardy. Which was kind of a violation of traditional mob protocol, because in the old days, if you and I are involved in the mob, we're fair game, but our families, our civilians, they're off limits. This kind of took it to a different level.
Now, let's talk about John Veasey as a witness. Phenomenal witness, captivated the jury, the courtroom, and delivered.
Yeah, I mean, this was a guy who, he's up on the witness stand, but it's like he's standing on a corner here in South Philly telling you stories. He was totally without guile. He was genuine, and that came across. And he talked about who he was and what he did, made no excuses. You know, he was involved in murders, he was involved in extortions. He talked about a time where he got a drill and drilled the guy in the head and pieces of his hair were coming out. All of that in the context of, this is my life, this is what I did, and now I'm putting it all in front of you because I want to change. And I remember distinctly at one point, he's telling all of these horrendous stories about the things he did and what he was involved in, and he makes mention of his mother who had passed away, and he pauses and he blesses himself and says, God rest her soul. And it was genuine, it wasn't fake, it wasn't fun, and then he just went on with his stories.
In the middle of some of the breaks, when he was sitting on the witness stand, he had a pen in his hand, and without anybody seeing, the judge or anybody else, he pointed at Stanfa and clicked the pen like this, like he was taking a shot at him, and he would do this. Nobody saw it, but then when they did catch on to it, it became a big thing in the courtroom.
Yeah, I mean, he was, John Veasey was John Veasey, whether he's on a street corner or on a witness stand. Nothing changed. And I think that was part of what captivated the jury, and that's why his testimony was so effective. It wasn't put on, it wasn't phony, it was what it was.
Let's talk about the results. He absolutely buried the Stanfa mob, John Stanfa and everybody below him.
No doubt about that. I mean, that was one of the most phenomenal RICO prosecutions that we've seen in the city, and we've had several phenomenal RICO prosecutions, but you ended up with a mob boss, John Stanfa, sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms. Stanfa, Frank Martinez, the underboss, the entire hierarchy of the organization. If you remember in the beginning, I think there were 26 defendants in that case. Ultimately, 24 either pled guilty or were convicted. And part of it was the effectiveness of the investigation, but part of it was these witnesses, especially Veasey, were phenomenal. In addition to Veasey, there was Phil Coletti, there was Rosario Boloki, there were a lot of other people. But John led the charge. And as I said, I've seen a lot of witnesses testify, a lot of good witnesses. I don't think anybody's been as good as he was.
Now, he testified, but he got 12 years in prison, did his 12 years, and he's out now.
Yeah, I mean, from everything that I know, and I know you know, he seems to have turned his life around, and he's legitimized himself, and he's doing quite well. And if you talk to people down here who knew him back when, they would be surprised at that, because he came from a kind of a rough background. I mean, his brother is killed as part of it, but his entire life, I think, was, he made no secret of the fact that at one time he was involved with drugs. It was a really rough lifestyle. And everything that I know, and I think you know, is he's turned that around.
Well, I won't say how I know, but my understanding is he's done very well for himself since he got out of prison, really turned things around. He's a businessman now. He's making good money. He's really living a stand-up kind of life at this point.
Yeah, I think he's one of the few guys that has taken advantage of the opportunity and has gotten a new life. I think Phil Leonetti's another. But if you can look at other informants, guys like Nick Caramandia, like Tommy Del Giorno, they never were able to spin it and legitimize themselves. But I think Veasey has.
All right, George, that's John Veasey. Next week, we're going to talk about Tommy Scafidi, nicknamed Horsehead.
Right, Tommy Horsehead, born and raised in South Philadelphia, fourth-generation wise guy, he testified. And Tommy was a guy who had a foot in each camp. And on one level, you can say he betrayed everybody. On another level, you could say he was betrayed by the organization.
Cried in court. He was
Absolutely.
so upset about having to testify against the mob.
Absolutely. I mean, he was a guy who believed in all of this thing. And it had passed him by. It was over. And I think he finally realized that.
All right. That's it for Mob Talk this week. We'll see you next week.
A lot